Hello, good afternoon. Does it work? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on disinformation. The title is Gatekeepers of Disinformation and the Role of Institutions in Protecting Democracy. So what we would like to do today is to tackle a critical topic, which is what is the role of EU institutions, in particular because here we are representatives, in shaping the narratives against disinformation campaign. And what have we seen during the European elections that we just had? Is the legislation that we have already in place enough, strong enough to enforce content moderation online? And what is the interplay with data protection laws? As you know, social media platforms nowadays are a vital communication tool for public administrations, for public institutions, authorities. However, they play a double role. No, we have on the one hand the role of offering the ground to combat disinformation, to make information actually, and at the same time they are precisely the tool that amplify disinformation. Also, we've seen the adoption of many laws in the EU, like the Digital Service Act, which is a testament of the EU's commitment to creating a robust legal framework to fight illegal content online, harmful content online. Today, we have fantastic panelists here that I will introduce in this very moment. Starting from the other side, we have Jakob Lolk, press officer in the spokesperson's office of the European Parliament. Following Telmo Baltazar, principal advisor on corporate and political communication at the European Commission. Pascal Chonard, director of the Authority for European Political Parties and European Political Foundations, and Eliška Pirkova, senior policy analyst and global freedom of expression lead at Access Now. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here to tackle this panel. I would like to start the very first question to Jakob, because I would like to hear a bit from the perspective of the European Parliament after the elections. So we've seen a growing discussion, but also fact-checkers, observatories such as EDMO or EU vs. Disinfo that have detected and exposed numerous attempts to mislead the voters during the campaign. To fight disinformation, we've seen also in the European Union that work together strongly under the EU flag to speak with one voice, basically. And it's true also that many institutions adopted their own strategies. So I would like to hear from you what the European Parliament did in terms of initiatives to combat disinformation and to ensure communication for the EU citizens during this election period. Thank you.
Does it work? Yes, great. Thanks a lot, Francesco, and thanks a lot for the invitation to come here today and talk a bit about the European Parliament's strategy to counter disinformation, not least ahead of the European elections. First, just a few words about where I work and the work we do in the spokesperson's unit in the European Parliament, where we have a team specifically dedicated to countering disinformation. And it's true that the European elections took place in a challenging geopolitical context this time. The Russian aggression against Ukraine, of course, was accompanied by large-scale disinformation campaigns. It also goes back to the COVID pandemic, Brexit, you name it. There are many things that go into this specific geopolitical context. And we have also seen over the last several years that elections have been a target of disinformation campaigns and information manipulation campaigns in order to undermine the electoral process, people's trust in the elections and people's trust in democracy, or just to polarize societies around elections. So that was a bit about the context. This also meant that countering disinformation was an integral part of the European Parliament's strategy, communication strategy ahead of the elections. So what does our strategy consist in? It's a popular saying to say that there is no silver bullet to fighting disinformation. It's not that you make one single EU law and then you solve the problem once and for all. That's unfortunately not how it works. So we need to work along several axes: legislation, proactive communication, resilience building, response in case there are incidents, but also network building, situational awareness. I'm going to develop a bit on these different aspects of it. But just a few general remarks. First of all, it's important to keep in mind that when we talk disinformation, it's not per se something illegal. It's what you could call lawful but awful content. So this is to distinguish it, for example, from hate speech, which is illegal in most jurisdictions. But we are fighting disinformation that is, as such, not illegal content. And this also means that we have to do it with the respect for fundamental rights, such as freedom of expression, for example, or freedom of opinion. Also, as the European Parliament, we are a very pluralistic institution with lots of members representing very many different opinions who have their freedom of mandate. So it's, of course, also not for us to go and say that some opinions are better than others or play a ministry of truth. So this is not what we do when we counter disinformation. This also means that when we counter disinformation or information manipulation, we look at the behavior behind it. We don't focus so much on the individual narratives, but we look at the manipulative behavior. We look at the tools, techniques, and procedures of disinformation actors. And we look at what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior, where we can see there is something more behind it, that it's not just one opinion being uttered, or one person behind an opinion, popular or unpopular, but there is something more behind it. There is some coordinated behavior in order to deceive, in order to undermine democracy. So that was a couple of general remarks. And then concretely, what do we do in the Parliament? Legislation, of course, should be mentioned. Parliament is one of the two co-legislators, so Parliament has been really involved in adopting legislation. I'm sure my co-panelists will go deeper into the details of that, but just to mention a few of the main pieces of legislation: GDPR, of course, and in this legislature we have had the Digital Services Act, the Act on Political Ads, the Artificial Intelligence Act, but also from a broader perspective, legislation to defend media freedom, to protect journalists, such as the Media Freedom Act or the law against strategic lawsuits against public participation, or the Anti-SLAPP Act. Also, I would like to highlight that there has been a special committee in the Parliament that has been working in this legislature, in this mandate period, a special committee on foreign interference, which delved into the topic of foreign interference, disinformation, information manipulation, of obviously being one of the main things they looked at, where they looked at foreign interference broadly speaking, and came up with lots of policy recommendations also, and recommendations for the EU institutions and the member states on how to be better at countering it. Then we have proactive communication, which is really one of the key tools we have at our disposal. It's not as such an anti-disinformation tool because it doesn't react directly to disinformation, but it's about getting our messages across. It's about being present online. It's about talking via journalists, civil society, content creators, influencers, in order to preempt manipulated narratives and manipulative behavior online, for example about the electoral process. So we put up an inter-institutional website on the elections, for example, as a concrete example of what we have done ahead of the elections, with information about the elections in each member state, with information about the elections how the elections were protected from information manipulation and cyber threats. Then we have the situational awareness. It's about monitoring what's going on out there, what is targeting the European Parliament, what is targeting the elections. It's of course necessary to have that insight in order to be able to react to it. Can maybe go a bit deeper into what we actually saw during the elections. Maybe I can do that a bit later if there's an interest for that. Then of course on the response side, if we see something, we need to have networks in place. We need to have procedures in place, what to do if we spot disinformation, information manipulation campaigns, sharing alerts, for example, internally with the other EU institutions or with the member states, alerting sometimes to media or fact checkers, strengthening proactive communication if we see something, or sometimes strategic silence can be the best tool to react to disinformation so as not to give it too much attention. And then the last chunk is what we call resilience building. It's a more long-term effort of building resilience in society against disinformation. It's not something you change overnight, of course. So it's the long-term effort of raising awareness of the threat from disinformation and also empowering citizens to help contribute to not spreading it by equipping them with knowledge, by equipping them with concrete tools of what they can do. And this is something we do a lot of in the team that I'm part of in the European Parliament, in a close collaboration also with the other EU institutions and civil society actors. So we talk to a lot of journalists, a lot of young people, content creators, civil society organizations, teachers. We give trainings on media literacy, briefings for journalists about disinformation and information manipulation. And through this, we seek to raise the resilience of society. We also produce our own content that we disseminate online. For example, we produced a series of so-called pre-bunking videos. Pre-bunking means to raise awareness of the techniques used by disinformation actors, so people are equipped to recognize them when they come across them, such as playing on strong emotions, for example, or polarizing societies. We also made a fact sheet with the tips on how to counter disinformation. Again, a very useful tool online and in our contacts with youth. And all of this content is produced in the 24 official EU languages. And needless to say, all of this is a team effort. It's not only the team that I'm part of, but we collaborate very closely with the other EU institutions, the Commission and the External Action Service in the first line, but also other actors such as the APPF, civil society, fact checkers. We have very close connections with the fact checkers in the European Digital Media Observatory, for example. We are part of the rapid alert system together with member state representatives and other kinds of collaboration. And then we also liaise with platforms. So that was hopefully not too long overview of some of the things we do.
No, actually, it was a very interesting overview of all the work that you do and all the strategies that you adopt. You said something very interesting, which is the part of resilience, in my view, because it touched upon something that we were discussing with Telmo a few minutes before the panel, the importance of building trust. So how do we build trust? What are the strategies? What are the methods to do that? And on this, I would like actually to ask Telmo about the European Commission strategies to address these challenges of disinformation on social media platforms. But let's see, we are in a moment of where the EU is trying to push as much as possible legislation to protect human rights, from the GDPR to DSA. We said there are also AI Act, and there are also many others. But from a let's say from a counteracting disinformation from a communication side, what the Commission is doing? What are the measures taken by the European Commission now in this very moment of geopolitical tensions?
Thank you, Francesco, and again for the invitation, and thank you for those present here who chose to be in the best panel in the afternoon. So again, big privilege to be here. I wanted, on your question, I wanted to start first with sometimes we, in my view, I think we undersell the things that we do collectively at the level of the EU. We're always very critical about ourselves, and we should be, because critical about the institutions so that they perform better. By the way, that's what journalism should be doing all the time, and NGOs, etc. But sometimes I think we really undersell the fact that we have been developing, as you said, Francesco, for the last decade or so, important types of legislation, in particular regulations, which at EU level apply directly over in the territory, on matters that possibly in the past or in some other areas of the world are even hard to think. As an example, considering the protection of personal data as an individual right as well, and that can be protected not just by national law but EU law. This is a point that sometimes we forget. The same if we apply this to the digital world, the Digital Service Act. We think, oh, it's not perfect. Well, it didn't exist in 2021 when it was initially proposed, and ever since negotiated, and now it's being enforced step by step, being told notably to these developers, the very large online platforms that we all use, that we all cherish, that we want to continue using. But now they know if you want to work in our market, and the market is not just Belgium plus Germany plus France, it's the EU market, here are a set of rules. Not just principles, but actually rules. And if you don't like it, we will activate them. And this is I think it's quite an advancement when it comes to protecting rights. Because we as EU institutions, we are then checked by our, shall we say, even legislative co-legislation, the member states and the parliament, they can change legislation. But if you want to work in our market, if you want to operate, if you want to have access to our data, here are the set of rules on the basis of which you have to operate. So this is the first point. It's quite an advancement. The DSA is now being implemented, already with guidelines being given to the very large online platforms. We should never use acronyms. But really to really be advancing this in a way that is really putting these operators also under the notion that they too have a role to play when it comes to countering disinformation. So this is the first point I wanted to highlight, is the work at the legislation point of view, which is, it's being done. It's work in progress, and believe me, we have many more colleagues, notably in Director General in Connect, as we call it, in charge of telecoms and IT issues, working very aggressively to implement, enforce this legislation. Then there's a question of the awareness raising, and sometimes, again, here is another area that we undersell the importance of working in this area. This is not hard law. This is something which basically is more of how to cooperate better, first of all, inside the different institutions. Let's start it a little bit. Believe me, it's not easy to make sure that the different, inside even the institution I work for, how to bring people together around the same messages about what needs to be looked at, notably when it comes to disinformation. Where is it coming from? What type of tools are being used? How to identify it? How to tackle? When to tackle? And who should tackle it in terms of public responses and reaction? So this is something that does not happen automatically. I mean, we are putting in place this necessary systems, task forces, to first of all, networks within the European Commission, as well with other bodies such as the European External Action Service, because of the importance of foreign interventions, illegal, but foreign interventions to manipulate messages working in our European space, as well as, and I wanted to mention this in particular, ahead of the European elections, an excellent whole of society approach, notably with the European Parliament and with the national authorities, to protect the democracy, which is to protect the European elections. And that sometimes we fail to see, because, the European elections, well, actually there are 27 elections for, let's say, a single European Parliament, but they are done by different authorities. So there was a need to ensure that everyone was singing from the same hymn sheet, that everyone had an idea, a similar idea of the threat, even if it could depend or if it could vary from, let's say, country to country. But there was a need for all of them to be alert. I'll give you a couple of examples of things that were detected because of this working together. The first thing was the ensuring that we had all the capabilities of detecting where eventually attempts to influence using disinformation and using different channels propagating that disinformation would be identified. One of the examples that was identified, I think, was in Germany, where there was people pushing the message that, oh, by the way, if you go and vote, don't forget to sign the ballot, knowing that, of course, this would mean that the vote would be invalid. But if you provide that type of, if someone, and I'm sure it was not someone from within the union, was pushing that message, would be undermining the results, because people could be led into it. So one of the ideas how to counteract this is, first of all, before the European elections, with the European Parliament, passing this message, increasing the knowledge about the dates, the processes, how to do it. And you have to work this not just from Brussels, but also with the national authorities. So it requires a great deal of coordination in terms of what messages to pass, when, and how, and through which media to get to as many possible number of people. The second point that was done also on this campaign, and it was done in connection with the, I don't want to use the acronym, the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services, done, it was the European Commission with the European Parliament and this ERGA, basically to ensure, again, awareness campaigns about the elections to make sure that we use the audiovisual, the work through their means as well, to try and promote as much, the fact that indeed people should participate and not be tempted by, disinformation campaigns. One, and this was seen by up to 300 million people, etc., and which allowed, in humble view, this awareness raising allowed not just the institutions talking directly to the citizens, but coordinating with the national authorities, that not all of them are always either aware or prepared or even equipped to deal with these types of threats. And the fact that there's a kind of coordination at EU level, which was done even at the level of the Coreper, thanks to the real action of the Belgian Prime Minister, Mr. De Croo, and the Prime Minister of Czechia, Mr. Fiala, who in April wrote to their counterparts and say, guys, we have to protect elections because I know, or they knew that there were foreign attempts to influence the process of elections, not least the result. And it is really fascinating that even if it's not just hard law issues, that because of that call for action, there was, as a result, this need to develop and, forcing to work together the different institutions and with the national authorities. Really, it is fascinating to see on how there is really this need to keep an eye on this, and not just one tool, no silver bullet, as you said, but really having a series of bullets used as appropriately, some with law, DSA, GDPR where appropriate, etc., as well as others which more awareness raising. Just one last point you've mentioned briefly, Jakob, but I wanted to highlight this. This was for the elections, okay? But it doesn't mean that after the elections, the world goes back to normal. No, these attempts to interfere with democratic processes will continue. It's a fact of life. If we live in a democracy, we have to fight for it and try to preserve it as much as we can. So there's also a need for us to continue to raise awareness, and including increasing the level of media literacy in the member states, so that actually people involved in the media from an earlier stage, schools, universities, teachers, they have to play their responsibilities. We have kids. You've mentioned also examples of actions that is done to to promote, let's say, more media literacy, but there's really a more need. I think we should even do more in the future. Really, again, to ensure what? To ensure that the information that people have access to is trustworthy. And this is the responsibilities also of, at least my last point, this is the responsibilities of public institutions. Public institutions in their communication action, they do not seek to be liked. They must seek to be trustworthy. That all their actions, be it, because we are involved in doing legislation mostly. So the law needs to be accepted, trusted. And if in the communication we are not also as trustworthy, we may lose the support and respect that people put on institutions and on the law. On that respect, by the way, let me, for those who like these things, there's a very recent report done by our scientists of the Joint Research Center, which is about trustworthiness of public communication. It's really fabulous. It's a scientific report, in as much as you can be scientific on social matters, but it is, and it's really done very seriously, and I really recommend that you read it. It's 120 pages worth reading, but 120 pages as the references.
We will. Thank you very much for your insightful intervention. I think you raised one point which is crucial, which is the fact that democracy needs to be built and kept day by day. This is very important. It's not something that ends with an election or with the next election. I mean, there are many areas of intervention, and of course, fighting disinformation is one of those. But of course, also legislation, building trust, media literacy, everything is in place to try to keep what we have and even to improve it. Of course, this I think was very interesting and an important remark. After having heard, let's say, the two perspectives of two institutions, there are other actors, of course, in the public debate. So my next question is to Pascal. So your authority has a very, very important role. Political parties are, of course, another actor as functioning as representatives of the citizens. So my question to you would be more on also thinking about the polarization of the debate at the political level and the public level. How your authority, how do you think it's possible, let's say, to ensure that European political parties that are registered under your authority can meet the standards of transparency, integrity? Is this possible to do?
Thank you very much, Francesco, for this introduction. Also, the question I'd just like to highlight to start with that we're very much part of the EU institutional framework as well, and proud of it. So I'd like to underline we also have an important role to play on the hard law side of things. To come back to one of the aspects that Telmo was mentioning, indeed. And for those of you who unfortunately, or perhaps understandably, are not regular readers of the regulation on European political parties, just 2-3 words in a nutshell on what we're actually doing, and then I'll try to develop how that is implemented in relation to the European political parties. European political parties are our stakeholders. They are not the parties at national level, but they are composed of parties at national level. So the interlinkage is very important. We have 3 areas of activity in relation to them. One is structural. So we register them. That doesn't just simply mean a notarial act. We check whether they have an actual political DNA, whether they are active in reality at political level in the European Union and across a number of member states. We also see to it that they continue to be transparent about the composition of their governing bodies, of their membership. The second area of our activity is financial supervision. once European political parties and foundations are registered, they have to deliver a number of financial information to the authority. And we go into those numbers and crunch them and check whether in particular there would be, for instance, donations from a non-EU origin that is prohibited at EU level. By the way, Telmo was mentioning we are underselling our legislation. I think this is a perfect example of how European legislation is in advance and an example for what could and probably should be done at all of the member states as well. On the side of the expenditure, we see to it that European political parties use the money that they have for European policy making and not for national politics. All of that flows into, and that's the third, but not the least area of our activity, in a proactive transparency process. So we put at the disposal of the public on our website a number of elements on the structure and the finances of European political parties and foundations. We also received an extra task from the legislator more recently, linked specifically to the European elections, where we are verifying whether personal data infringements, and here's an important link to the conference topic of today, were taken advantage of by European political parties or foundations for electoral purposes. So this is our portfolio. Now, how does that link at all to disinformation, to misinformation? Well, more than one may think at first. The baseline, the underlying systemic idea of all of these areas of activity of the authority is protection of democratic integrity. That includes protection against foreign interference, but more widely speaking, also against other forms of undermining attempts against democratic processes. And disinformation is one of them. We are looking at it from a very specific angle, but I'd like to say we are part of that team democratic integrity with the other institutions in doing so. And there are a couple of very concrete and rather rigid rules which we actually are able to check and potentially sanction in case of infringements. One is that in the area of finances, as I was mentioning, we are not bound to just simply accept if we see a certain transaction being purported to come from a given origin. We're going to go deeper and we're going to see if this last mile financial transaction that comes into a European political party or foundation actually originates from where the bank statement says it comes from. Another example would be that in structural terms, we are enabled to make sure that information that we receive on the current composition of a governing board is accurate. And then we also go into areas more closely linked to personal data. And in that respect, we have developed with the data protection authorities at member state level a very active network where we commonly assess whether certain activities in the course of electoral campaigns for the European elections are infringements on the data protection framework and are being used for the advantage of one actor or another. And that is much less technical than it may sound when you first read the article of the regulation. What are we talking about here? We're talking about phenomena like data theft, opportune dumps of personal data just before an election, deep fakes, all the phenomena that are the cancerous forms of social media use can potentially come within the framework of this tool. So you can see, I believe, that there is a certain setup of safeguards which we are entitled in a certain specific field of democratic activity, European political parties, but nonetheless, to bring to bear. And I think we can say that, therefore, the European legislative framework is not defenseless in the face of the threats that undoubtedly not only exist, but are operationally used by the adversaries of democracies. Where I would just simply, and let me add this one more point, see low-hanging fruit to still go forward from here, that's in the coordination of the various tools we have. There are legislative acts in specialized areas of our respective areas of work. The GDPR, we've spoken about DSA as well, the regulation that governs the authority, national legislation also on cybersecurity, for instance. But these various acts have a tendency to create expert pools which should interact more. Expert pools of great quality. Expert pools at EU level, at the Commission, in the European External Action Service, in the European Parliament, perhaps in a humble way also at the authority. We need to bring them together. And the EDPS is doing a very important job in this respect, together with the European Data Protection Board, which coordinates the various data protection authority at member state level. But what I have as a takeaway from our recent efforts in the run-up to the European elections, we've done multiple events with specialized authorities at member state level. We have gathered for a tabletop exercise, for instance, not only data protection authorities, but cybersecurity authorities and Europol and other expert organizations at EU level. My takeaway is these various communities, they don't necessarily have an established practice of interacting across the boundaries of their areas of specialization. And that's, I think, where we have a job to do now that we have these substantive rules in place quite solidly. And I should add one, the political advertisement regulation, very recently published in the official journal, which will enter into application entirely by 2025. Let us together work on these topics, because our adversaries, they are not looking at separations of competence. They are just attacking.
Thank you very much. This is a very important point. The working in silos very often misses the link between the competencies, no, of different authorities, but also within the same commission, for instance, or other institutions. Sometimes this may not pose the problem, but let's say it makes harder to find a solution, you know? So I think this was a very important point to remark, and thank you very much for the kind words on the work of the DPS in making, together with the DPB, of course, a pool of experts that are key in certain areas of our work. Now I would like to take the perspective of a global civil society organization, because they work on defending, let's say, digital rights of individuals from a, let's say, different perspective, but we say the same, let's say, passion that we do. So what do you think, Eliska, are the most pressing challenges in combating disinformation on social media, online disinformation, let's say? Do you think that EU institutions have been doing a good work, both from a communication point of view, but also from the legislative side, as we have discussed now with our panelists? And also in terms of cooperation with civil society, what do you think, how do you think is going?
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Just very quickly, my name is Eliška Pirková. I work for Access Now. We are a global human rights organization that defends and extends digital users at risk around the world. So that's our mantra. That's the mandate of the organization. And this is a great question. And I think I will speak mainly from the perspective of legal and policy responses by the EU to the spread of disinformation online, since communication, I'm no expert on that topic. But of course, we saw sort of a almost, I would call it a regulatory race in a way, starting from this mandate of the European Parliament as well as the College. Where a number of very essential and important legislative proposals and now already adopted regulations came to their existence. And you mentioned that we are coming to this topic from a different perspective than for instance, EDPS. I don't think so, because one of the advantages these regulations do have, or let's say we speak specifically about the Digital Services Act, that's precisely that fundamental rights angle that is incorporated within the regulation, and that makes it very different also to the predecessor of the DSA, and that was e-commerce directive, which was heavily single market driven. So even though there were fundamental rights mentioned in the recitals of the directive, it was a very sort of different animal and slightly outdated. And we were pushing for similar type of law being adopted at the EU level for many years, and it finally manifested to the Digital Services Act. Digital Services Act is not alone in the fight against the disinformation, but one element of the DSA that I want to emphasize in this context is precisely probably the most novel aspect, and those are due diligence obligations for large platforms and search engines. And specifically in the context of disinformation, they are crucial because, as many of you know, disinformation as such is not illegal content. So it's a still legal content that can, however, carry significant harm and risk to society, to our electoral integrity or civic discourse. But as such, we should not be adopting the laws that would criminalize disinformation or, God forbid, fake news, the term that we've been systematically fighting against for many years, but it's so popular that we will never get rid of it. But I think precisely criminal laws that are targeting these type of content and intentionally singling out the content that is actually legal. First of all, these laws do not meet the criteria of necessity and proportionality, neither principle of legality. And since we are a global organization, we see how these type of regulation is being adopted by more, let's say, authoritarian leaning regimes who use them for persecution of human rights activists, defenders, or simply opinions that are critical towards government. So this is just to kind of place the debate in that right context. And so DSA goes about it differently. It focuses on platform systems and processes, so their content recommender systems, content moderation, but also content policies, and how these systems can endanger fundamental rights protection, and how they can impose the risks on our rights, or rather also societal risks. And electoral integrity and civic discourse are being specifically listed in the DSA, but it's just the peak of an iceberg. And it's sort of an open-ended list, because it would be in no one's benefit if DSA has some hard list of all societal risk, because there is no way to foresee them. DSA also has a complementary legislation, and we saw European Union adopting so-called the guidelines on the electoral integrity that came about, I think they were launched in March and eventually adopted in April, where also the Commission collected input from civil societies and stakeholders on the guidelines. And I will speak or touch upon those maybe a bit later. But for instance, the guidelines specifically tackle the issue of AI-generated disinformation or the spread of AI-generated content. Good news is that even though there were many worries from policymakers, media, and even citizens about the danger of AI-generated disinformation, Gen AI did not destroy European democracy. And we see the similar outcomes also, for instance, in case of elections in India, where, yes, generative AI was used, but at the end it has much less impact that it was initially anticipated and expected. And we can speak about it a bit further later. Then we have also code of practice on this information from civil society perspective. This is one of those co-regulatory measures that were directly negotiated by civil society organizations. Maybe some of you are in the room. Access Now is not a signatory, but we were consulted on a number of those measures. And there are, for instance, things like rapid response mechanism put in place that platforms have to, well, don't have to, but committed on voluntary basis to comply with prior to elections. Code of practice should be changing into code of conduct, which it will make it a mitigation risk measure under the DSA, and it will give more power to the GOAT, but we are not there yet. The Commission is currently working on turning the code into more powerful tool under the DSA. And the political advertising regulation, that's the final one I'll mention, and I know it's a long list. And that's a regulation that it's still waiting for its prime, so to say. It was already mentioned that it will come fully into force in autumn 2025. It's a bit of a shame and sort of a kind of lost opportunity because there are a number of very sort of positive elements within the regulation, a number of those that we still remain concerned about. But it also contains the ban on the use of sensitive categories of personal data for the purpose of targeting, as well as direct reference to inferred and observed data and their abuse, especially by so-called ad delivery techniques, which are incredibly opaque systems where you as an individual user, you cannot have any control over how your often most sensitive data are being abused by those systems in order to target you with the niche advertising and having quite far-reaching impact. So we hope that we can achieve even more with the political advertising regulation. We were pushing for even a rather stricter ban, and we had also a great opinion from the European Data Protection Supervisor that helped us during our advocacy efforts there. But it's a start. I also agree with one thing, and that's how these different pieces will complement each other. We have two powerful regulations. We have DSA, which is sort of umbrella. We have a sister regulation on political advertising. We have a number of co-regulatory measures, and somehow they will have to fit into each other and hopefully create that defense mechanism against the spread of disinformation while respecting fundamental rights protection. And this is not the easy task. And then there is also the enforcement piece. How are we going to make sure that especially those measures that hold promise, such as risk assessments and other due diligence obligation for large platforms, are truly meaningfully enforced? These are early days. We just finished the work on those regulations, and in terms of cooperation with civil societies, and I can mainly speak for the DSA and political ads regulation, we definitely saw lots of openness from regulators to speak to civil societies, for hearing out our recommendations with the DSA. We even managed to get those recommendations and turn them into now legally binding articles in the law. Which I think from that perspective that was very successful. But I also want to emphasize one thing, and that's the advantage that we had with the DSA, that we had the same agenda as the regulator. So from the start, we wanted to bring fundamental rights protection in the core of platform accountability. We wanted to create user-centric regulation that that sort of departs from these potentially harmful approach of focusing on concrete categories of content and instead having more holistic approach. And that was sort of successful strategy because we share that goal. Civil society was doing excellent work also on AI Act. There was incredible coordination and expert input, but because the regulatory goal and fundamental rights protection angle was perhaps less relevant, we succeeded less in those outcomes. And now, right after European election, we all know how they turned out to be. We all know that we will be facing with more right-leaning political groups in the European Parliament, and where fundamental rights protection might not always be number one priority for these actors and for these players. And this also poses question how civil societies can continue fulfilling their role of being watchdogs of democracies. So for now, the cooperation from my side, the files that I work on, was successful. Whether that's going to be the same case in following 5 years remains to be seen.
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you very much for your intervention. Now, I had actually 1 million follow-ups for all of you, but I can see that we are already running late of time. So I would like to also involve the audience if they would like to make some questions. So if there are any questions in the audience, I will be happy to. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Albinati, and for the all panelists for being here. Yeah, actually, when I hear the term disinformation, of course, there is two sides that we can determine. One is, as Mrs. Pilkova mentioned, like the information generated by the large language models. I am also working for a European institution, for European Patent Office for the risk and compliance team per se. And lately, of course, when we talk risk around LLM, the main hot topic is like possible data breaches and etc. But me specifically, I always thinking, and I was trying to emphasize that the possible disinformative contents coming from the generative tools, and then we integrate them in our internal processes already. We started integrating them into our internal processes already with the Microsoft Copilot. And now I'm trying to work on some sort of a internal awareness campaign to fight against possible disinformation, against this information coming from LLM. What will be the key message, if you would say, to talk with my colleagues about the disinformation coming from the LLMs and the disinformation coming from the human aspect, like the human content, especially in the big social media platforms, as Mr. Jacob mentioned a lot. I have a follow-up question for the social media platforms, which is that I'm originally from Turkey, and in my country, they also applied for this kind of legislation to fight against disinformation in the social media, but it ended up with a lot of conversation and contradiction for the right of freedom of speech in the social media. But at the same time, as many of you mentioned, this really important, especially when we consider the youth, people's political decisions are really get affected by the social media content and possible disinformation in the social media. My second or follow-up question is that where do we draw the line as a government or as institutions that to implement these kind of possible ways to fight against disinformation in the social media via not harming or damaging the freedom of speech in social media? Thank you very much.
If it's okay, I can start on the second part of it. It's really the focus on what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior. It's not individual opinions that we want to fight. I mean, people have the right to their own opinions. Sometimes opinions might be misguided. They might be wrong. They might be unpopular. But as long as it remains in the remit of what is legal, then it's not what we're out there to fight. It's when we can see in our analysis that there is coordinated behavior, that there is something more behind it, be it an external actor or something else. Very often it is external actors. Then that's when we need to go out and counter it, because then it's not just an individual opinion anymore. Then it's somebody or some entity that wants to undermine our societies and undermine our democracies. So that's where we draw the line, if we can see this coordinated inauthentic behavior.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So where to draw the line? I think it very much, when we speak about platform accountability, whether that's with combating disinformation online, we are definitely in the sphere of freedom of expression and freedom of opinion. These are fundamental rights that are very deeply contextual, and the level of their protection will always be connected to the state of rule of law in the country. And more democratic backsliding we see in some countries, the more we have to realize that perhaps the regulation, the legally binding regulation, might not be the best answer, because the potential for the abuse is too big. then we are in the realm of self-regulation, and of course we have number of evidence where we can see that platforms are not always doing their work, or not always, most of the time. And even in the context of the EU elections, we actually very much saw how the same issues that we keep naming, platforms have been doing again and again. There was also some progress. We cannot say that platforms didn't do anything. We saw Meta's ad repositories, for instance, taking off, and they were quite useful. Also for the researchers to notice that the enforcement of the policies on political advertising was not done properly, and number of the advertisement that directly spread disinformation content were approved by Meta, not only Meta, by a number of other platforms. So, and these are the content moderation issues, such as insufficiency in their content policies, vague definitions of, or lack of definitions altogether, and enforcement that is lacking behind, that we've been analyzing, naming, and asking platforms to fix it. So I think then it's very much about striking the right balance and realizing, because especially in the context where, you know, we cannot really rely on the functioning rule of law, platforms are also the last resort for many, for spreading their information, for receiving information, for accessing them. And in that case, I think our best bet is then to work closely with platforms and forcing them to be more diligent and enforcing those human rights standards and incorporating them into their own policies and adopting different measures. And there are plenty of recommendations that Access now worked on together with partners. It's just, of course, very tricky to find the right and foreseeable mechanisms if we cannot rely on legally binding regulation.
I wanted just to add one element, which is the changing nature of the way in which we all, particularly those who are not in this room, the younger, get news. Things have changed. I mean, we all know. We used to get news differently, notably mostly via media authorities or people to whom we gave the authority to interpret reality for us, to interpret political reality for us. This, of course, has been changing quite dramatically. I was reading a report that was just published, I think, last week by Reuters Institute, Politics, Oxford University, really recommended, which shows not just the way in which people are getting news is changing, but also the way in which news, particularly political news, is getting to them. Increasingly via short video formats, very short. So what used to be the realm of, let's say, media interpreters interpreting to us the political reality is now being sent to us very directly by an increasingly atomized number of data originators, okay, and being given to us directly without sometimes any filter. So which increases for me the fact that as we move ahead, is this you cannot just sort out by legislation, because it would get into the points that Eliska presented very well about, you know, the boundaries between freedom of speech, which we value as well as a fundamental right in the EU and elsewhere, but particularly in the EU, versus versus like the state telling you what you can say, or worse, what you can hear. But so that's to draw the lines that we have also to be equipped as public authorities, wishing also to participate in sending out trustworthy news, the importance to be present and to be seeing the different trends, because things are really evolving quite quickly. And if we were able to say that indeed we cooperated very well in the run-up to the elections that took place a couple of weeks ago, and it was great that the campaigns served its purpose, etc., we have to start already preparing the next set one, because as you said, I think, Pascal, you know, the others, foreign interference will not be waiting for us, and they do not have the same let's say, limitations that we have to have because of the rule of law and the necessary legislation. So in my view, it is important that we keep aware, tell people, and particularly invest on media literacy. You have to be able to detect what is information trustworthy, depending on the sources, from what it is not. And this is something that indeed you can get guidance. Institutions will get guidance, but at the end of the day, it will be up to you to choose also which channels you want to get your news from, which ones you want to be educated. You will get guidance from valuable sources, notably from public institutions who want to be trustworthy, want to remain to be trustworthy. But it's a rough world out there.
Yeah, just a small word from my side. We at the authority are, if you will, in the luxurious position that there is a rather clear line in the legislation that we're applying, which I'm just giving, away here for as a matter of example, without saying that it is generalizable. But there's a clear distinction in the regulation that we apply between political opinions that, of course, we are entirely neutral to, and information provided about structural and financial facts by the political parties. So the regulation is very clear. European political parties and foundations are accountable to the public and hence to the authority to give accurate information about who they are and where their money comes from. And on that basis, these are the parameters of democracy. You can start building political debate.
I know there were other questions, but I think we are over time, unless really quick, super quick. Super quick. Okay, thank you very much.
If you can further elaborate, because I thought that was extremely interesting when the power of authority were enlarged to data protection, at least as a recognition to the fact that data protection, data breaches plays a key role. So I wanted to have your feelings, whether you have been supported enough because it was completely new for you, but especially what is the link between the fundamental values, European values that were at the heart of your regulation when you make like registration, and data protection. So how you see this interplay and how you see the fact that your authority has been given sanctionatory power on this specific subject. Do you see it as a shift and a recognition on data protection for electoral process?
Thanks very much. Yes, I'll start, if you'll allow me, the other way around and take the second question first. Yes, absolutely. It's been a seminal moment, sort of a paradigm shift, this recognition, and very much goes in the direction that I was mentioning before, that it's connecting the dots, it's breaking open silos. That was the spirit of this new provision, in recognition of the threat being a horizontal one rather than a sectoral. So personal data protection has an enormously important role to play in the protection of democratic integrity. Because political actors tend to speak in interpersonal narratives. So it's a normal tendency to speak about your political opponent as the person that he or she is, and that is perfectly fine under normal circumstances, but there is a limit, and that limit is clearly drawn now by the law, and we're happy about that. But I'm coming to the second aspect, which is your first question. Have we been supported enough on that? Well, I cannot say that there was stumbling blocks put in our way, but it was an uphill a process in preparation for the elections, because we had to raise awareness with different communities of experts about a subject that is not in the core of their usual exercise of functions. And a bit like we are here in side session 2, This was sort of side session 2 of what they have been doing, the colleagues in the data protection authorities, the colleagues in the electoral commissions, the colleagues in the cybersecurity authorities, and in the law enforcement community. And these are basically all of them together, the ones concerned. And our ambition has been, and I think we're there now, that may sound like a relatively mild level of ambition, but it was important. When you see something and you're not sure whether the other one may be interested, pick up the phone and call them. You know, we need to be aware that there's another expert, another authority that might need to have this information. This is something that other areas of EU integration have gone through a couple years earlier. We have had that in the fight against terrorism. We have had that in economic law, integrational aspects, internal market law. And it's now the time to do the same for democratic integrity.
So I wanted just to add one element might be interesting on the data protection side of things. If one goes a few years back in time and does a little bit of institutional archaeology, notably on data protection regulation, I mean, I'm fortunate to have been involved in that process, where we suffered within the Commission by the time that became known that the revision of the Data Protection Directive of 1995 would come not in the form of a directive, but the form of a regulation. We suffered a violent disinformation attack because it was being accused of stifling innovation, making everyone's impossibility to actually access the internet, etc., because the Brussels regulators would be putting rules and basically transforming what was a nice directive, but into a regulation that would affect what was at the time, let's say 12 years ago, let's say a growing market for notably social media and the famous vlogs. It was really an active part of this information, so much that, for instance, a month before it was initially proposed even by the Commission, in the internal, so we are on the archaeology, internal processes of decision of the European Commission, we have 9 negative opinions from out of the, let's say, roughly 30 services of the Commission that had been consulted on the initial draft. 9. It is unique. It had never been seen, and mostly of these negative opinions actually reproduced the texts that had been circulated well in advance by known, let's say, VLOPs at the time. So you see the type of, what did we do? Well, keep calm and keep negotiating because we had the law on our side. And actually now it generated the GDPR after some time. Trust European law, but keep pushing for it because it will provide a solution. Pascal's mentioned one point that we sometimes forget is, actually, it's one point that is really very valuable, is these communities of experts that we will be creating in different parts. And when we are addressing something which is new and changing very rapidly, which is the nature of information, disinformation, it's really important that we try and have as many multidisciplinary approaches like the panel today here, including the civil society and other, let's say, circles which are not here, to really be continuing all the time to have this conversation rather than in simple silos. Data protection is important, yes, but so is freedom of expression, so is freedom of establishment of these VLOPs to operate in the markets, provided that they are the rules. In this case, again, the DSA provides very good, and thanks for having pushed for it also for many years.
If I may just add to that very, very quickly, I love the idea of keep pushing because, for instance, even if we have in political advertising the ban on the use of sensitive categories of personal data, inferred and observed data remain only in the recital, which is a huge lost opportunity. And I also want to say that based on that regulation now, so we don't only praise the European Union, in order for the political advertisement to be political, the sponsors of that advertisement have to assign political to it. And if they don't, it won't be actually subject to the content moderation of political advertising. Regarding the clear delineation between political speech and political advertisement, for instance, we were really strongly fighting there in this regulation to have this regulation and the scope only focus on the sponsored for and paid for political content, because the initial definition would actually capture the work even of civil societies like ourselves who do not target anyone. So just keep pushing and challenging, because we can still get further.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in a round of applause to our speakers, because it's time to wrap up. Very interesting conversation. Thank you very much.